Hello, I'm Joan Kee. I'm a contributing editor to Artforum and a professor at the University of Michigan, and this is Artforum's Interpretations. I'm interpreting Afro Asia today really as a provocation to think about how we approach different histories of art in ways that may not seem intuitive, but in fact, which have always been in place. And so one of the questions I always had was to think about why is it that representations of historical figures in textbooks were white, when in fact the vast majority of people that I had encountered were people of color. And when you're young, you don't really think about these questions in a systematic way, but when you're older, you start realizing, okay, so 90% of the world is either from Africa or Asia, or who could claim Black or Asian descent, yet what accounts for the absence of their works or accomplishments from what we regard as history? And those questions didn't really congeal until I went to college and I was able to encounter the work of academics like Judith Wilson, who in turn introduced me to Camille Billups, who in turn introduced me to the work of Howardena Pindell, and which also led me back to the show Ancestors, which took place at Kinkelaba House and the Asian American Art Center in 1995. One of the works that struck me especially was that of Howardena Pindell. And she did a work that was titled 3 Views of Mount Fuji. Now, Pindell had gone to Japan in 1981. And while there, she had a time that is best described as complex. This is one of the questions that Afro Asia asks us to consider, is that Afro Asia is fundamentally against the idea that information or experiences can be easily processed. So what is it about the friction that Afro Asia causes that allows us to think beyond perhaps the limitations of chronology or geography? Now, the last work that I wanted to briefly mention it's more of a pairing. So about 5 years ago, I had proposed a show to Asia Society Hong Kong to look at the works of Ufan and David Hammons. I thought how interesting it might be to see that rock sort of ease its way into Ufan's circle of intimates so that the conversation could become something like a congress or a parliament of stones talking, debating, or even quarreling with one another. That show would have been called A Stone's Throw. So in reference to their mutual use of stone, but also in thinking about how both artists consider displacement not only as a form of personal experience, but as a formal proposition. In my understanding, I don't think Ufan and David Hammons ever met one another, but there is something about their works that strike up the kinds of conversations Afro Asia implores us to consider. So in thinking about or interpreting Afro Asia, I want to think about it really less of a place or a conjoining of peoples, or even rather than thinking about it as a reference, to really think about it as something that has not yet been formed, but should be formed through these sorts of questions about conversation, about togetherness, about coexistence, and what it means to live with friction but not be ruled by it.